This is a story about my life, something that really happened to me. It's strange how a lifetime of work can be undone in a single evening, but that's what happened, and I want to tell you how I took it all back. The gold watch in my palm was impossibly heavy, its polished surface reflecting the cruel, glittering lights of the ballroom. I was standing on a small stage at the Boston Harbor Hotel, my own retirement party, when Julian Croft, the man I'd mentored, the son of my best friend, leaned into the microphone and announced to 300 of our colleagues that he was dissolving my entire legacy. He called it a strategic realignment, a phrase so sterile it could scrub blood off the floor, but we all knew what it was, a public execution. My division, my life's work, my loyal staff, all of it, gone, declared obsolete in the time it takes to give a toast. He smiled that perfect, predatory smile of his, the one that graced the cover of magazines, and the weight of the watch felt less like a gift and more like an anchor, pulling me down into the cold, dark silence. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The first few weeks were a blur of humiliating courtesies. Sympathy cards arrived at my Beacon Hill brownstone, each one feeling less like a comfort and more like a tiny tombstone for my career. Friends called, their voices thick with a pity I didn't want, asking how I was holding up. I gave them the answer they expected. Enjoying the rest, I'd say, my voice a hollow echo in the quiet of my study. Finally have time to read all these books. I'd gesture vaguely at the leather-bound volumes lining the walls, books on market theory and economic history that I'd already read a dozen times over. There were props in the new play I was starring in, The Contented Retiree. It was a role I was spectacularly failing to inhabit. The truth was, I was adrift. For 50 years, my life had been governed by the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange. My pulse had risen and fallen with the Dow Jones. Pendleton and Croft wasn't just my company, it was the scaffolding of my entire existence. My late wife, Eleanor, had always joked that the ticker tape was my heartbeat. Now, there was just silence. A profound, suffocating quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall only seemed to amplify. Julian, of course, was anything but quiet. He was the new king, and he wanted everyone to know it. The financial news was saturated with him. There he was in the Boston Globe, announcing the firm's pivot to high-risk, high-reward crypto funds. There he was on Bloomberg, slick and confident, denigrating the stagnant, risk-averse strategies of the old guard. My strategies. He never used my name, but he didn't have to. Every word was a meticulously crafted insult, painting me as a dinosaur whose extinction was a prerequisite for progress. He moved the firm's primary offices from the stately granite building we'd occupied for half a century in the financial district to a soulless glass and steel monstrosity in the seaport, a place that reeked of new money and fleeting trends. He renamed the company, scrubbing my name from the letterhead as if I'd never existed. It was now simply Croft Innovations. It was a masterclass in erasure. The calls started coming about a month after the party. First, it was Robert, my head of analytics for 30 years, a man who could read a balance sheet like a sonnet. His voice was strained. Arthur, my pension statement, it doesn't look right. The numbers are off. I told him it was probably just a clerical error, a consequence of the messy transition. But then came a call from Maria, my executive assistant for 2 decades, a woman with a mind like a steel trap. They're denying my 401k rollover, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. They're claiming the funds are tied up in a long-hold investment vehicle. It makes no sense. 1 call could be an error. 2 were a coincidence. But by the time I heard from a half-dozen of my oldest, most loyal employees, all people I had personally promised a secure retirement, a cold dread began to seep into my bones. These weren't just clerical errors. This was a pattern. This was deliberate. Julian was playing games with their lives, with the money they had earned, with the promises I had made to them. The pity I'd been drowning in began to curdle, hardening into a cold, sharp-edged suspicion. I tried to access the company server from my home computer, using the emeritus access Julian had so graciously bestowed upon me. Access denied. The message blinked on the screen, a digital slap in the face. He'd locked me out. He had cut the final thread, sealing me off from the world I had built. He thought it would be the end of it. He thought the old man would just fade away into his leather-bound study and wait to die. He had no idea what a 74-year-old man with nothing but time on his hands was capable of. He had forgotten the first rule of this business, a rule I had taught his own father: every system has a backdoor. And I was the one who had built it. It was an old ghost, a piece of code I'd had a programmer embed in the firm's first networked server back in 1988. It was a simple command line interface, a fossil in the age of graphical user interfaces and biometric security. I designed it as an emergency override, a way to access the core systems if everything else failed. In the dozens of upgrades and migrations over the decades, no one had ever bothered to look for it, let alone remove it. To a tech prodigy like Julian, it would be invisible, like trying to find a Latin inscription in a mountain of binary code. It took me 3 days. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, felt clumsy on the keyboard. The syntax was archaic, the commands long forgotten. But slowly, painstakingly, the memories returned. I pored over my old notebooks, the ones filled with my spidery handwriting, until I found the sequence. On the third night, fueled by lukewarm tea and a growing sense of righteous fury, I typed in the final command. A single, blinking cursor appeared on a black screen. No logo. No password prompt. Just a silent, digital void waiting for instructions. I was in. The server was a maze, a digital reflection of Julian's ego. Flashy, overdesigned, and needlessly complex. But I wasn't interested in the facade. I was looking for the foundation. The accounting servers. The pension management folders. The ledgers. Most of them were protected by layers of modern encryption that would take me years to break. But Julian was arrogant. He believed his firewalls were impenetrable. He didn't feel the need to encrypt everything, especially not the archives. And in a folder labeled Legacy Accounts, I found it. It wasn't just one thing. It was a spiderweb of transactions, a cascade of numbers that made my blood run cold. Julian was using the Employee Pension Fund, a sacred trust, the money Robert and Maria and dozens of others were supposed to live on, as his personal slush fund. He was leveraging it to make wildly speculative investments in fly-by-night crypto schemes and volatile overseas startups. When he won, he funneled the profits into a private holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. When he lost, and he lost often, he would cover the gaping holes by selling off the firm's long-term, stable assets, the very bedrock of the company's security, and misrepresenting the sales in the quarterly reports. He was a gambler using the life savings of his employees as chips. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it left me speechless. It was a ticking time bomb. The market was booming now, hiding his sins, but the moment it turned, the entire fund would be exposed as a hollow shell. The company would collapse, and hundreds of people would be left with absolutely nothing. He wasn't just erasing my legacy. He was burning it to the ground and salting the earth. I leaned back in my chair, the screen's glow casting long shadows across my study. The quiet of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with a single, clarifying thought. He thought age was a weakness, a liability to be discarded. I was about to prove that it was the sharpest weapon he would ever face. My war had just begun. The first step in any war is reconnaissance. You don't fire a shot until you know the enemy's position, his strength, and his weakness. Julian's strength was his public image. He was the darling of the Boston financial scene, a visionary who had shaken the dust off a venerable old firm. His weakness, I suspected, was the same as any narcissist's: he believed his own press. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he couldn't imagine a doddering old relic like me could ever touch him. He saw a ghost. He didn't see a strategist. So, I let him see the ghost. I became a caricature of the man he'd painted me as. I started taking my walks in the Boston Public Garden, always around midday when the lunch crowd from the financial offices would be out. I wore my oldest tweed coat, even when the weather was a little too warm for it. I walked with a slight stoop I didn't entirely need, my hand resting on a handsome cherrywood cane my wife had given me for my 70th birthday. I sat on the benches, feeding the pigeons and reading the newspaper, letting the world see Arthur Pendleton, a man resigned to his golden years. I wanted the whispers to start. Poor Arthur, they'd say. Lost without the firm. Looks like he's aged 10 years. Let them think it. A ghost can move through walls. A ghost can listen without being seen. While I was playing the part of the fading patriarch, I was also making calls. Not to board members or executives, Julian had those in his pocket. I called the people he had cast aside. The fossils, as I'd heard his young acolytes call them. I started with Robert, my old head of analytics. I met him not at a restaurant in the financial district, but at a quiet diner in Dorchester where no one would recognize us. Over greasy bacon and watery coffee, I laid it out for him. I didn't show him the files I'd downloaded, that would be too risky. Instead, I posed a series of hypotheticals. Robert, I began, stirring my coffee, if a man wanted to hide losses in a pension fund, how would he do it? Robert, a man who thought in spreadsheets, didn't even blink. He started rattling off methods, offshore shells, inflated asset valuations, mismatched reporting cycles. He described, almost to the letter, the exact scheme I had uncovered. I then asked another question. And if a man wanted to find proof of such a scheme, where would he look? Not in the digital files, Robert said immediately, wiping his mouth with a napkin. That's a fool's game. Julian's a digital native. He can hide anything in the cloud, bury it under a mountain of code. No, you'd need the paper. The original documents. The transaction confirmations, the custodial reports. They have to exist, by law. The SEC requires a physical record for a 7-year lookback. He told me about the off-site storage facility. A place out in Woburn called Iron Mountain. It was where we sent all our physical records for deep archiving. I had forgotten it even existed. Julian, with his obsession for a paperless office, most certainly had. Robert looked at me, his eyes sharp. Arthur, what is this about? Is this about my pension? I put my hand on his arm. Robert, I made a promise to you and to everyone who helped me build our firm. I intend to keep it. Can you give me a list of every box we sent to that facility in the last 5 years? Accession numbers, dates, everything. He nodded slowly. I'll see what I can do. He was in. The next person I called was Maria. She had been my gatekeeper for 20 years. She knew every secret, every contract, every private deal that had ever been made. More importantly, she knew the people. I met her at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a place of quiet beauty that felt a world away from Julian's cold, glass tower. We stood in the courtyard, the gentle sound of the fountain filling the space between us. He's a thief, Maria, I said, my voice low. He's stealing from us. She didn't act surprised. She just looked at me with sad, knowing eyes. I know, she whispered. I tried to warn you. The little things. The way he'd talk about the clients, like they were marks. The way he treated the junior staff. I need your help, I said. I need to know who on the board is still loyal to my legacy, to what the firm was supposed to stand for. And who is in Julian's pocket. Maria was a master of informal intelligence. She still had lunch with the assistants of the current board members. She heard the whispers, the gossip, the unfiltered truths that never made it into a boardroom. Within a week, she had a list from me, annotated with her own sharp insights. Thompson was bought and paid for, his son had been given a cushy, no-show job. Reynolds was a coward, he'd go whichever way the wind was blowing. But there were 2, maybe 3, who were uneasy. They came from old money, from a time when a man's word was his bond. They were uncomfortable with Julian's reckless style, but they had no proof, nothing to act on. They were my potential allies. My ghost army was beginning to assemble. The final piece was the most dangerous. I needed a way to get into that storage facility. The records were under the company's name. I couldn't just walk in and ask for them. I needed a key. I found it in the most unlikely of places, my late wife's garden. Every Sunday, for 30 years, I'd hosted a barbecue for my senior staff and their families. It was a tradition. Julian had come as a boy, running around the manicured lawns of our Brookline home with my own children. And so had a man named Frank Rizzo. Frank was the head of facilities, a gruff, hard-working man who had started in the mailroom and worked his way up. Julian had fired him in the first week, replacing him with a sleek, outsourced logistics firm. I found Frank's number in an old address book. He was retired, living down in Quincy, spending his days fishing. I drove down to see him. We sat on his porch, overlooking the bay, and for the first hour, we just talked about the old days. About his kids, about my grandkids. About how much we missed my Eleanor and his Susan. Finally, I got to the point. "Frank," I said, "I need to get into the Woburn facility." He looked out at the water, his face unreadable. "That's company property, Arthur." "It's our company, Frank." "He's destroying it. He's stealing from us." I told him about the pensions. I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. Frank was a man of simple principles, and loyalty was at the top of the list. "The access protocol is all biometric now," he said, shaking his head. "Thumbprint, retinal scan." Julian had it all updated. My heart sank. It was a dead end. "But," he continued, a slow smile spreading across his withered face, "the override system for a power failure is still analog. A key. And I was supposed to turn mine in, but with all the confusion of them kicking me out. I guess I forgot." He disappeared into his house and came back a moment later. He pressed a small, simple brass key into my hand. It looked like a skeleton key from a forgotten era. It was beautiful. "The alarm system is on a separate grid," he warned. "You'll have about 15 minutes before it reboots after a localized power cut. You'll have to be quick." I closed my hand around the key, its sharp edges digging into my palm. I had my intelligence network. I had my inside man. And now, I had the key. The ghost was about to become a thief. The industrial park in Woburn was a desolate landscape of concrete and corrugated steel, a place utterly devoid of charm or character. It was the perfect place to bury secrets. I sat in my parked car, a modest sedan I'd bought after my retirement, 100 yards from the entrance to Iron Mountain. It was just after 2 in the morning. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and a cold, damp wind whipped across the empty parking lot. My heart was hammering against my ribs with a force I hadn't felt in years. This was insane. I was a 74-year-old man, a titan of industry, about to commit breaking and entering. But the image of Maria's trembling voice, of Robert's worried face, burned in my mind. This wasn't just about my legacy anymore. It was about their lives. Frank's instructions were precise. The main power grid for the facility was controlled by a utility box on the north side of the building, hidden behind a row of overgrown hedges. He'd told me which breaker controlled the specific section of the building where our records were stored. Killing power to the whole building would trigger a direct alert to the police. Killing power to just one section would be logged as a minor, localized fault, something the night shift security guard, a lone man in a booth a quarter-mile away, would likely ignore until the morning. It was a loophole only someone who had designed the system would know. My joints ached as I got out of the car. The tweed coat I wore for my public appearances was replaced by a simple black windbreaker. I moved slowly, sticking to the shadows, my cherrywood cane replaced by a heavy-duty flashlight. Every rustle of leaves, every distant rumble of a truck on the highway, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I felt alive. I found the utility box easily enough. It was secured with a standard padlock, which I cut with a pair of bolt cutters from my garage. My hands were shaking, but I managed to open the heavy metal door. Inside was a dizzying array of switches and breakers. I pulled a laminated diagram from my pocket, a copy of the original blueprints Frank had kept in his basement for 30 years. I found the right breaker, took a deep breath, and flipped the switch. A section of the building's exterior lights flickered and died. A deep, mechanical hum from a nearby air conditioning unit sputtered into silence. The 15-minute countdown had begun. I moved to the service entrance, a heavy steel door Frank had described. The biometric scanner next to it was dark, lifeless. The only thing that worked was the old-fashioned keyhole below it. The brass key slid in smoothly. With a satisfying clunk, the lock turned. The door was heavy, and I had to put my shoulder into it, but it swung open into a cavern of darkness. The air inside was cold and smelled of dust and aging paper. My flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the gloom, revealing towering shelves that stretched up 50 feet to the ceiling, all of it packed with identical cardboard boxes. It was a mausoleum of forgotten facts. I checked my watch. 12 minutes left. I pulled Robert's list from my pocket. He had narrowed it down to 7 possible accession numbers, boxes that contained pension fund management and asset liquidation reports from the last 3 years. The facility was a labyrinth, but Robert had also given me a floor plan. Aisle 17, Section C, Shelf 42. I moved as quickly as my old legs would carry me, my footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. The feeling of being watched was immense, even though I knew I was alone. I found the aisle and ran my light along the labels, my breath misting in the cold air. Finally, I saw it. P&C PFM 2022. Pendleton and Croft, Pension Fund Management. The box was on a high shelf, at least 10 feet up. My heart sank. There was no way I could reach it. Then I saw it, a rolling ladder, the kind you see in old libraries, tucked away at the end of the aisle. It was heavy and rickety, but it would have to do. I pushed it into position, the wheels groaning in protest. With each step I took up the ladder, it swayed precariously. My knees screamed, and my head felt light, but I kept going, one hand gripping the cold metal rail, the other holding the flashlight. 7 minutes. I reached the shelf and pulled the box towards me. It was heavier than I expected, filled with thick stacks of paper. I couldn't take the whole thing. I had to find what I needed and get out. I sat on the top rung of the wobbly ladder, the box balanced on my knees, and began to rifle through the contents with frantic energy. The beam of my flashlight danced across dense pages of legal and financial jargon. Transaction reports, custodial statements, liquidation orders. It was exactly what Robert had said would be here. And stapled to the back of a liquidation order for a block of blue-chip stocks, a sale that was reported in the digital records as a simple portfolio rebalancing, was another document. It was a receipt for a wire transfer for the exact same amount, sent to a holding company I didn't recognize, Albatross Ventures LLC. The routing number was for a bank in Grand Cayman. This was it. The paper trail. The undeniable link between the pension fund and Julian's offshore account. It was the Rosetta Stone of his entire fraud. I ripped the 2 documents from the file, folded them carefully, and shoved them deep into my jacket pocket. I pushed the box back onto the shelf just as the lights in the facility flickered back on. The power had rebooted. My time was up. Scrambling down the ladder, my leg caught on a rung, and I tumbled the last few feet, landing hard on the concrete floor. A sharp, searing pain shot through my ankle. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to my feet. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping me going. I limped back through the maze of shelves, my ankle screaming with every step. I didn't dare use the flashlight now. I stumbled through the darkness, using my hands to guide me along the shelves, until I finally saw the faint outline of the service door. I slipped out, closing it gently behind me, and melted back into the shadows. The drive back to Boston was a haze of pain and triumph. Every time I hit the brake, my ankle sent a fresh wave of agony through my body, but I barely noticed. My mind was consumed by the folded papers in my pocket. They were more than just evidence. They were a weapon. Julian was a creature of the new world, a world of smoke and mirrors, of digital illusions and plausible deniability. He thought he was untouchable in his glass tower. But I had reached back into the old world, a world of paper and ink and consequences, and I had found his anchor. and I was going to use it to drag him down to the bottom of the sea. The next morning, I couldn't put any weight on my left foot. A trip to the doctor confirmed what I already knew, a fractured ankle. The irony was not lost on me. In the middle of a high-stakes corporate espionage mission, I was laid low by a rickety ladder. The doctor fitted me with a heavy orthopedic boot and gave me a pair of crutches. It was a setback, but as I hobbled around my study, I realized it was also a gift. It perfected my disguise. The image of me as a frail, doddering old man was now complete. Who would ever suspect that a man who could barely get up a flight of stairs was orchestrating a corporate takedown? Julian certainly wouldn't. His arrogance was my greatest ally. He was at the height of his power, a media darling basking in the glow of his supposed genius. Boston Magazine had just run a fawning cover story on him, the man who made Pendleton relevant again. They'd used a photo of him standing in his gleaming seaport office, the Boston skyline behind him, looking like a king on his throne. The article was filled with his insufferable buzzwords: synergy, disruption, paradigm shift. He dismissed my 50-year tenure as a time of unimaginative stewardship, a polite way of calling me a fool. Reading his words, my resolve hardened into something cold and diamond-sharp. My ghost army continued their work. Maria fed me a steady stream of inside information. Julian was planning to take the company public in the next 6 months. He was courting major underwriters, promising them astronomical returns. This was his endgame. A massive IPO would be the final act of his heist, allowing him to cash out for hundreds of millions of dollars, leaving a hollowed-out company for the public to hold the bag. The fraudulent pension fund numbers were being used to inflate the company's valuation. He wasn't just stealing from his employees, he was preparing to defraud the public on a massive scale. Robert, my analytics guru, worked his magic on the documents I'd found. He produced a full forensic analysis, a clear, step-by-step report that any layman could understand, tracing the money from the pension fund to Albatross Ventures. He uncovered something even I had missed. Albatross Ventures was a shell corporation, and its sole director was a man named Charles Croft, Julian's deceased father. He was using his own father's name to shield his crimes, a final, posthumous act of disrespect to the man who had been my partner and friend. That discovery felt like a personal betrayal beyond all others. The problem was, we still weren't ready to strike. The documents I had were damning, but Julian's legal team was a pack of sharks. They could tie us up in court for years, claiming the papers were forgeries, burying us under motions and discovery requests until I was dead and my allies were broke. I needed more than just a smoking gun. I needed to fire it in a crowded room where no one could deny what they saw. I needed an unimpeachable third party to validate our claims. I found her in a young, hungry financial blogger named Sarah Jenkins. She ran a small, independent website called The Street Scout. It wasn't the Wall Street Journal, but it had a reputation for dogged, fearless reporting. She wasn't on Julian's radar. He was too busy courting the major networks. He wouldn't see the attack coming from a small blog run out of a coffee shop in Somerville. I reached out to her through an encrypted email address, signing my message only as the friend of the old guard. I sent her a small, tantalizing piece of the puzzle, a single, heavily redacted transaction report. Enough to prove I was legitimate, but not enough to give the whole game away. She was hooked. We agreed to meet. The location was my choice, the Maparium at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. It's a 3-story, inside-out stained glass globe. The acoustics are bizarre. You can stand at one end of the bridge that runs through the center and whisper, and a person at the other end can hear you perfectly, while someone standing right next to you hears nothing. It was the perfect place for a clandestine conversation. I sat on a bench, looking like any other tourist, my crutches resting beside me. Sarah was young, maybe 30, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She stood across the globe from me, a good 30 feet away. "You're the friend of the old guard," she whispered, her voice carrying across the space as if she were standing right beside me. "I am," I whispered back. "And I have a story for you that's going to make your career. But you have to do this my way. No mistakes. No shortcuts." I spent the next hour laying out the whole sordid tale, feeding her the details of Julian's scheme piece by piece. I saw the look in her eyes shift from skepticism to shock, and finally to a cold, journalistic fury. She understood the stakes. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not the Globe or the Journal?" "Because they are slow, and they are compromised," I answered. "Julian wines and dines their editors. His firm buys millions in advertising from them. They will kill the story before it ever sees the light of day. You are nimble. And you are hungry. I will give you everything, the documents, the forensic analysis, on-the-record testimony from the people he's ruined. But you will publish it at the exact moment I tell you to. Not a second before." She agreed. The trap was now set. I had the evidence, the witnesses, and the delivery system. All I needed was the right stage. And I knew exactly where it was going to be, the annual shareholder meeting. It was 6 weeks away. It would be held in the auditorium of his new seaport tower, a temple he had built to his own ego. It would be his coronation. But I intended to make it his execution. The weeks leading up to the shareholder meeting were the longest of my life. There was a constant, gnawing fear that some part of our fragile plan would fall apart. That Julian would get spooked and move his money. That Sarah would get a better offer and sell our story to the highest bidder. That one of my people would crack under the pressure. But my ghost army held firm. They were bound together by a shared sense of betrayal and a fierce loyalty to the firm we had built. We were the old guard, and we were making our last stand. My days were spent on the phone, coordinating our attack with the quiet precision of a battlefield general. I used burner phones, paying for them in cash at a convenience store in Alston. I never met with any of my team in the same place twice. We were a conspiracy of retirees, communicating in whispers and hypotheticals, moving like ghosts through the city that Julian thought he owned. I remained in my role as the forgotten founder. I accepted an invitation to the Boston Symphony, knowing Julian would be there. I made sure he saw me in the lobby during intermission, looking frail and lost, leaning heavily on my crutches. He approached me, a look of smug pity on his face. "Arthur," he said, his voice oozing false concern. "Good to see you out and about. Are you holding up okay?" "I'm managing, Julian," I said, my voice deliberately weak. "Just taking it one day at a time." "That's good," he said, patting my shoulder in a gesture of nauseating condescension. "You've earned the rest. Don't you worry about the firm. We're in good hands." He walked away, and I watched him go, a cold smile touching my lips. He had no idea the ghost he was pitying was about to haunt his house down to the foundations. The plan for the meeting was simple, but its execution had to be flawless. As a shareholder, I had retained a small but not insignificant block of stock, something Julian had overlooked in his purge. I had the right to speak at the meeting. My name was on the list. Maria had confirmed it. Robert, Maria, and a dozen other loyal former employees had also pooled their resources to buy a few shares each. They would be my chorus, scattered throughout the auditorium. Sarah Jenkins had her exposé ready to go. The moment I gave the signal, she would hit publish. A link to the story would be simultaneously emailed to every major news outlet in the country, the SEC's Public Affairs Office, and, most importantly, to a list of every single person registered to attend the meeting. We would turn Julian's audience into his jury. The day before the meeting, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I visited the cemetery where my wife, Eleanor, and my old partner, Henry Croft, Julian's father, were buried. I stood before their headstones, the wind cold against my face. "Henry," I said to the silent stone, "I'm sorry for what I'm about to do to your son. But you, more than anyone, would understand that the firm's integrity is paramount. He has betrayed everything we built." I placed a hand on the cold granite. "I made you a promise. I promised I would always look after him. I'm afraid this is the only way I know how." The morning of the meeting, I dressed with meticulous care. I chose my oldest, most conservative suit, the one I hadn't worn in years. It was slightly too large for me now, making me look even more diminished. I left the orthopedic boot and the crutches at home. In their place, I took my cherrywood cane. I needed to be able to stand on my own 2 feet for this. When I arrived at the Croft Innovations Tower, the lobby was a media circus. Julian was at the height of his glory. The company's stock, based on his fraudulent numbers, was soaring. He was giving a confident interview to a local news channel, talking about a future of limitless growth. I slipped past the cameras, just another old man in the crowd. Inside the auditorium, the atmosphere was electric. The room was packed with investors, analysts, and journalists, all of them eager to hear the golden boy speak. I found my seat in the 3rd row. I saw Robert give me a subtle nod from across the aisle. Maria gave me a small, reassuring smile from the back of the room. My army was in position. The lights dimmed, and a slickly produced video played on the massive screen behind the stage. It was a montage of Julian shaking hands, Julian ringing the opening bell at NASDAQ, Julian staring thoughtfully at a computer screen filled with glowing charts. It was a monument to his ego. Then, he walked out onto the stage to thunderous applause. He looked immaculate in a tailored suit, his smile bright and predatory. He launched into his presentation, a dazzling display of charts and graphs all showing an impossible upward trajectory. He spoke of record profits, of revolutionary AI trading algorithms, of a new era of prosperity. It was the performance of his life, a masterpiece of deception. I let him talk for 20 minutes, letting him build his own pedestal higher and higher. Finally, he came to the question and answer session. Our first question, his assistant said, comes from Mr. Arthur Pendleton. A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to me as I slowly, deliberately, got to my feet, leaning on my cane. Julian's smile tightened just a fraction of a degree. This was an unscripted moment, and he didn't like it. Arthur, he said, his voice like honey laced with arsenic. An honor. I'm so glad you could make it. Thank you, Julian, I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent auditorium. I don't have a question. I have a statement. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the wire transfer receipt to Albatross Ventures. I'm curious about the company's relationship with an offshore entity called Albatross Ventures, registered in the Cayman Islands. Specifically, I'm interested in a wire transfer made to that entity on October 12th of last year for $11,200,000, the exact amount generated from the liquidation of the Employee Pension Fund's safest block of index funds. The change in the room was instantaneous. The electric buzz of excitement was replaced by a tense, dead silence. Julian's face went pale. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Arthur, he stammered. That's an internal accounting matter. Is it? I asked, my voice growing stronger. Because I believe it's a matter for the Securities and Exchange Commission. I looked up towards the back of the room and gave Sarah a short, sharp nod. It was the signal. My phone vibrated in my pocket. At the same moment, phones all across the auditorium began to buzz and chime as the email hit their inboxes. A low roar began to build as people stared at their screens, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. The headline of Sarah's article was simple and devastating: The Croft Innovations Deception, How a Wall Street Wunderkind Gambled Away His Employees' Future. Julian stared out at the sea of illuminated faces, his own face a mask of horror. He knew. He was trapped. This is slander, he shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking. These are baseless accusations from a bitter old man who couldn't accept his own obsolescence. But it was too late. The dam had broken. Robert stood up. I can confirm the forensic accounting, he called out, his voice ringing with authority. The numbers in this article are correct. I've seen the original documents. Then Maria stood up. And I can confirm that Julian Croft was the sole executive with the authority to order those liquidations without board approval. One by one, my ghosts stood up, a dozen of them, scattered throughout the room, each one adding their voice, their piece of the puzzle, their testimony to his crimes. They were no longer invisible. They were an army of the wronged, and their voices were a tidal wave of truth that washed away all of Julian's lies. He stood on the stage, speechless, as his world crumbled around him on live television. And then, as if on cue, the main doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. 2 men and a woman in dark, conservative suits walked in. They had the unmistakable air of federal agents. The trap had sprung. The chaos in the auditorium was immediate and absolute. The moment those SEC agents walked in, it was like a switch was flipped. The investors who had been applauding Julian minutes before were now shouting, their voices a cacophony of anger and betrayal. The journalists, smelling blood, swarmed the stage, their cameras flashing like strobe lights, capturing every detail of the king's public dethroning. Julian stood frozen for a moment, a cornered animal caught in the glare of 100 headlights. He looked from the agents to the angry faces in the crowd, and then his eyes found mine. In that single, brief glance, I saw it all, the shock, the hatred, the dawning, horrifying realization that the doddering old fool he had so casually dismissed had just dismantled his entire universe. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just held his gaze, my expression calm, letting him see the quiet, implacable resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. He had mistaken my age for frailty, my patience for weakness. He, who lived in a world of frantic, high-speed trades, had no comprehension of a long game, of a strategy that unfolds not in seconds, but over months. He was a sprinter, and he had just run headfirst into a wall built by a marathon runner. The agents were calm and professional. They spoke to Julian in low tones, then escorted him off the stage through a side door, away from the ravenous pack of reporters. The meeting was over. The company, as he had shaped it, was over. The crowd began to disperse, talking excitedly into their phones, the news of Croft Innovations' spectacular collapse already spreading like wildfire through the financial world. My ghosts, my loyal team, slowly made their way to me. Robert clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes wet with tears. "You did it, Arthur," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." Maria hugged me, holding on for a long moment. "Thank you," she whispered. There were no grand speeches, no victory laps. Just a quiet, profound sense of relief. We had faced down the dragon and won. We had taken back what was ours. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Julian's fraud was laid bare for the world to see. Sarah Jenkins became a star reporter overnight. Her blog was bought by a major media conglomerate, and she won a dozen awards for her exposé. The SEC froze all of Julian's assets, including the funds in Albatross Ventures. It turned out he had stolen far more than we ever knew. A court-appointed receiver was put in charge of the company. The board was dissolved. The flashy seaport offices were sold off. The name was changed back to Pendleton and Croft. I was asked to step in as an interim advisor, to help steer the company back to stability. I agreed, but only for a short time. My goal was not to reclaim my throne, but to ensure that the people who had been wronged were made whole. We worked with the receiver to liquidate Julian's ill-gotten assets and replenish the pension fund. We rehired the best of the old staff, the experienced, steady hands that Julian had so foolishly cast aside. We restored the principles of integrity and long-term value that had been the firm's bedrock for 50 years. Julian Croft was eventually charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. With the mountain of evidence we had provided, his high-priced lawyers could do little more than negotiate a plea deal. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal prison. I saw a picture of him being led from the John Joseph Moakley U.S. Courthouse, his tailored suit replaced by a drab jumpsuit, his confident smirk gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated stare. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 3 months. I, on the other hand, felt younger than I had in a decade. The purpose, the fight, had reignited a fire in me I thought had long since gone out. But my time in the spotlight was brief. Once the firm was stable, I stepped away for good, handing the reins to a new, trustworthy CEO. My work was done. My promises were kept. I finally, truly, retired. My life is quiet again now. I take my walks in the public garden. I read my books. I spend time with my grandchildren. From the outside, nothing seems to have changed. I am once again playing the part of the contented retiree. But this time, the role fits. The suffocating silence I once felt in this house has been replaced by a peaceful quiet. The ghosts of the past have been laid to rest. Julian's parting gift, the heavy gold watch he gave me at that humiliating party, sits on the corner of my desk in my study. I never wear it. I keep it there as a reminder. A reminder of the arrogance of youth, of the folly of underestimating your opponent. A reminder that in a world obsessed with speed and disruption, the most powerful weapons are often the ones that are overlooked: patience, experience, and the wisdom that only comes with age. Julian thought he was the future. He saw me as a relic of the past. He never understood that the past has roots, and those roots run deeper and hold stronger than any glass tower he could ever build. The end.